The phone rang 4 times before it went to voicemail. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe she was in the shower. Maybe she'd left her phone in her coat pocket and couldn't hear it. My wife has always been like that. She'd set her phone down somewhere and forget it existed for hours. I called again. Voicemail. I was standing in my garage in Kingston, Ontario, holding a wrench I hadn't used in 20 minutes because I'd been too distracted to remember why I picked it up. It was a Thursday afternoon in early November, the kind of gray, flat day we get here where the sky looks like it's been pressed down with an iron. My wife had driven to Ottawa 3 days earlier. Our son and his wife had just bought a house in Barrhaven, and she'd gone up to help them settle in. Paint a room. Organize the kitchen. Do the things mothers do when their children move somewhere new. I was supposed to join on the weekend, retaught the night before, and she'd sounded tired but fine. Normal. I called her cell again. Nothing. I tried the house number at our son's place. It rang out. Something shifted in my chest. Not panic yet. Just the quiet, wrong feeling that comes when a small thing doesn't add up. I checked my watch. 2:30 in the afternoon. She would have had lunch by now. She'd be awake, moving around. She always answered. I thought about calling our son, Martin, but he was at work. His wife, Sandra, might be home, but something made me hesitate. I'm not sure I can explain why, even now. I just didn't reach for that option. Instead, I locked the garage, went inside, and stood at the kitchen counter for a long moment. Then I grabbed my keys. I drove the Highway 401 east to Ottawa in just under 2 hours. I won't say I was speeding. I will say I wasn't paying much attention to what the speedometer read. The whole drive, I kept telling myself I was overreacting. She'd probably gone out for a walk along the Retta River Trail and forgotten her phone. She'd probably laugh at me when I showed up. I pulled onto their street just after 4:30. It was already getting dark, the way it does in November in Ontario, that particular gray closing in from all sides. Their house was a semi-detached on a quiet crescent, brick front, 2 cars in the driveway, my wife's Subaru and Sandra's Civic. The lights inside were on. I was halfway up the front walk when the door to the attached unit opened. The woman next door came out fast, not walking, almost running, and she was looking straight at me. I'd met her once, briefly at the housewarming the previous month. Her name was Paulette. She was in her mid-50s, small woman, gray hair pulled back, and she had an expression on her face I will never forget for the rest of my life. "Don't go in," she said. She said it quietly, which somehow made it worse than if she'd shouted. "Please, don't go in yet. Something has happened." I stopped walking. "What do you mean? Where's my wife?" Paulette stepped toward me and put her hand on my arm. "The ambulance already came. About an hour ago. She's at the Civic Hospital. They took her. I called 911. I'm the one who called." Her voice was shaking slightly. I heard something. A noise. And then nothing. And then Sandra's car was still there, but no one was answering the door. I had a bad feeling. I went around the back and looked in the window, and I could see your wife on the kitchen floor. The world went very small and very still. What happened to her? I don't know. I don't know. They wouldn't tell me anything. I'm so sorry. Please, go to the hospital. I don't remember getting back in my car. I remember being in the parking lot of the Civic Hospital, and then I remember a set of sliding glass doors, and then I remember giving my wife's name at the front desk and watching the woman behind the counter pick up a phone. They put me in a small room off the main corridor, not an examination room, more like a waiting area, with chairs that had seen better days and a window that looked out onto a concrete wall. A nurse came in and told me my wife was stable, that they were running tests, that a doctor would come speak with me shortly. I sat in that room for 45 minutes. The doctor was a young woman, calm and precise in the way that good doctors are when they are telling you something serious. She sat across from me, and she said that my wife had been found in a state of severe hypoglycemic crisis. Her blood sugar had dropped to a level that was, she paused here and chose her word carefully, incompatible with continued consciousness. Without intervention when she did, without the neighbor calling when she did, my wife would not have survived. "She's diabetic," I said. Because my wife is not diabetic. My wife has never been diabetic. My wife is 61 years old and takes a blood pressure pill and a vitamin D supplement, and that is the entire list. The doctor looked at me steadily. No. That's what concerns us. Someone with no history of diabetes presenting with this level of hypoglycemia. There are natural causes we need to rule out, but there is also the possibility of exogenous insulin. I didn't know that word, exogenous. I had to ask her to explain. Insulin that came from outside the body, she said. Administered by injection. I heard what she said. I understood the words. But some part of my brain simply refused to assemble them into meaning for a long moment, the way you sometimes stare at a sentence and the letters stop making sense. You're saying someone injected her? We're saying it's a possibility we have to investigate. The police have been notified. They'll want to speak with you. My wife was conscious by the time they let me see her. She was propped up slightly in the hospital bed, an IV in her arm, and when I walked in, she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as exhausted relief. She reached for my hand. She told me what she remembered, which wasn't much. She'd been in the kitchen making tea that afternoon. Sandra had been there earlier, had made tea for both of them, and then left. She said she was going to the grocery store. My wife had felt tired after that, more tired than she should have been, and she'd sat down at the kitchen table. The next thing she remembered was waking up in the hospital. She didn't remember falling. She didn't remember anything between sitting down and waking up with an IV in her arm. The police came that evening. 2 officers, and then later a detective from the Major Crimes Unit. A woman named Reyes, mid-40s, methodical in a way that was quietly reassuring. She asked my wife questions, asked me questions, and then she asked one question that made the room feel different. She asked whether anyone had a financial reason to want my wife out of the picture. I told her I didn't understand what she meant. She was patient. She explained that they were treating the incident as a suspected poisoning until the toxicology results confirmed otherwise. She asked about our estate, our will, life insurance, whether anyone knew what was in those documents. My wife and I looked at each other. We had a will, updated about 4 years ago, straightforward, everything to each other, and then divided equally between our 2 children, Martin and our daughter who lives in Halifax. Martin had always known this in broad terms. He'd actually been the one to suggest we update the documents, back when he and Sandra were first engaged. He said it casually at a Sunday dinner that it was good financial planning, that his financial advisor had told him most people their age didn't have current documents. He'd offered to recommend a lawyer. At the time, I thought he was being responsible, thoughtful even. I told him we'd handle it ourselves, which we did. I didn't give the conversation another thought. Detective Reyes thanked us and left. Toxicology came back 36 hours later. It confirmed exogenous insulin. Someone had injected my wife with a dose calculated, and I use that word deliberately because the forensic pathologist who later testified used it, and I've never been able to get it out of my head, calculated to cause a fatal outcome. The dosage was not accidental. It was not a mistake in measurement. It was a quantity chosen for a specific result. The insulin, they determined, had most likely been administered through the tea. Dissolved. My wife had drunk it without knowing. Sandra was arrested 4 days after my wife was admitted to hospital. The evidence came together the way evidence sometimes does, not in one dramatic revelation, but in pieces. A receipt from a pharmacy in Canada, 3 weeks before the incident, for diabetic supplies including insulin, purchased under a different name but caught on a loyalty card linked to Sandra's email address. A text message to a friend, deleted but recovered, in which Sandra described my wife as the reason Martin would never have access to his full inheritance. A search history that a digital forensics officer described in court in the flat tone of someone reading a grocery list, dosage calculations, detection timelines, how long insulin remained in the system, whether it could be detected if the hospital didn't look for it specifically. She had looked for that last thing. She'd read extensively about it. She'd concluded, apparently, that if my wife simply collapsed and died, it might look like a cardiac event. What she hadn't planned for was Paulette. Paulette, who was a retired emergency room nurse, who had seen the position of my wife's body through the back window and recognized something in it, who had called 911 immediately and told the dispatcher specifically to mention to the paramedics that hypoglycemia was a possibility and to test for it. The paramedics had done exactly that. The fast-acting glucose they administered in the kitchen before the ambulance even left the street was what kept my wife alive. When I found this out, when Detective Reyes told me what Paulette had done and what her background was and how the sequence had unfolded, I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot for a long time. I didn't cry exactly. It was something else, something that doesn't have a clean name, gratitude so large it had no place to go. Martin's role became clear during the investigation, and this is the part that cost me the most sleep. He was not the one who purchased the insulin. He was not the one who prepared the tea. But he had known. The text messages made that plain. There were exchanges between him and Sandra going back 2 months, in which the plan was discussed, refined, and decided upon. His contribution was largely logistical. He'd confirmed to Sandra which days the cleaning company would not be at the house. He'd created an alibi for himself by booking a client meeting in downtown Ottawa that afternoon, a meeting his calendar app confirmed, a meeting he attended and was photographed at. He knew. He let it happen. He was in a boardroom on Elgin Street while his mother was dying on a kitchen floor 4 kilometers away, and he had known it was coming. My son was 41 years old. He had a good job in commercial real estate. He had a house. He had a house RRSP from what I understood. He had no debt that I knew of. My wife and I were not wealthy, but we had done reasonably well. The house in Kingston was paid off. There was some savings, some investments. The life insurance was not enormous, but it wasn't nothing. And he had decided that waiting was not something he wanted to do. Sandra was charged with attempted murder and convicted. The judge sentenced her to 14 years. Martin was charged as an accessory before the fact. He pleaded guilty. He received 7 years. I know there are people who will read those numbers and feel what I feel, which is that they are not enough. The prosecutor explained the factors at sentencing to me beforehand, the legal framework, the distinction between the principal offender and the accessory, the credit for the guilty plea. I listened and I understood, and I still think 7 years is a number that does not match the weight of what he did. My wife's physiotherapist told us that the hypoglycemic event likely caused some minor cognitive effects that may be permanent. She has trouble with word retrieval sometimes now, small things. She knows what she wants to say, and the word is just slightly out of reach. She says it's like having a name on the tip of your tongue, all day, about ordinary things. That is what 7 years bought. Before the sentencing, I went to see Martin in the remand center where he was being held. I had not seen him since his arrest. I drove to Ottawa alone on a Tuesday morning, went through the process of being cleared to visit, and sat across from him at a table in a room with fluorescent lights and a corrections officer standing near the door. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, he's always been taller than me, but smaller in some way I can't quantify. He said he was sorry. He said Sandra had pushed the idea, and he hadn't stopped it. He said he loved his mother. I looked at my son for a long time. Then I told him that I had retained a lawyer, and that I had already taken the necessary steps to update our will. That neither he nor Sandra nor any future children of his would receive anything from our estate. That our daughter in Halifax would receive everything. That this was not a threat, the documents were already signed. It was simply information I thought he should have. I told him I didn't hate him. I told him I didn't know what I felt, and that I thought it would take a long time to find out. I told him that his mother had asked me not to come, that she could not see him yet, and that I was respecting that. Then I left. The drive back to Kingston is about 2 hours and 15 minutes on a clear day. I did it without the radio on. I thought about the Thursday in November when I'd stood in my garage holding a wrench and felt something was wrong. I thought about how close the margin was. 45 minutes, 1 retired emergency room nurse, 1 good instinct. That was the distance between my wife making tea in the kitchen and not being here anymore. Paulette came to Kingston to visit us in February. My wife made dinner and we sat at the table for 4 hours. We talked about everything except what had happened. We talked about her grandchildren and our granddaughter in Halifax and the way Canadian winters have changed since we were young. Near the end of the evening, my wife reached across the table and took Paulette's hand and held it for a moment without saying anything. Some things don't need to be said. My wife still has trouble with word retrieval sometimes. On good days, it barely happens. On harder days, she'll stop mid-sentence and go quiet for a moment, reaching for something just out of reach. And I'll wait. And she'll find it. And we'll keep going. We take walks along the lake when the weather allows. We updated our estate plan. We changed the locks and the alarm codes. Small, practical things that turn out to matter. I am 64 years old and I have learned something that I didn't know before and wish I had never needed to learn. The people who can hurt you most are not strangers. They are the ones who know your routines, your habits, which day the cleaning company comes, how you take your tea. They are the ones who sat at your table at Christmas and watched you open gifts and calculated, somewhere behind their eyes, what everything was worth. I don't have a tidy way to end this. I don't think it ends. You carry it and you keep going and you hold on to the people who came through it with you. That's the only thing I know how to say that's true. I think about cause and effect a lot more than I used to. Not in any mystical sense. I'm too old and too practical for that. But there is something I've come to believe, quietly and firmly, which is that the choices people make tend to find their way back to them. Not always quickly, not always cleanly. But they do. Sandra made her choices. She researched them, planned them, and carried them out with a deliberateness that still takes my breath away when I think about it. And Martin made his not by acting, but by knowing and staying silent, which is its own kind of action. What they both seemed to believe was that they were smarter than the situation, that they had calculated every variable. What they hadn't calculated was Paulette. That's the thing about integrity. And I mean the real kind, not the word people use in speeches, but the actual day-to-day practice of paying attention and doing what you know is right, even when it costs you something. Paulette didn't have to go around to the back window. She didn't have to call 911. She didn't have to tell the dispatcher about hypoglycemia specifically, drawing on 30 years of emergency nursing that she'd retired from and could have easily left behind. She did all of it, because that's who she is. And my wife is alive, because that's who she is. And my wife is alive, because of it. I've thought about what Martin must have believed about himself during those months when the plan was being made. I think he probably told himself he wasn't really doing anything. That Sandra was the one acting, and he was just present, aware, not stopping it, but not doing it either. That kind of thinking is a particular failure of honesty, the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, but hollows a person out from the inside. He was intelligent enough to help plan something intricate. He wasn't honest enough with himself to name what he was doing. Those two things existing together in the same person. That's what I find hardest to understand, even now. My wife does her word retrieval exercises every morning. Small things. The physiotherapist gave her a set of cards, and she works through them at the kitchen table with her coffee. Some days she breezes through them. Some days she stops and waits, and the word comes slowly, like something surfacing. She doesn't complain about it. She has a patience with herself that I find genuinely remarkable, and I've known her for 39 years. That patience, that willingness to keep going through something hard without bitterness. That's a kind of strength I don't think can be manufactured. You either build it over a lifetime, or you don't. My wife built it. I watched her do it in ordinary moments I didn't always recognize as the building blocks they were. What I want to say, if there's anything useful in this story, is that the three things that actually mattered when everything fell apart were not money, not planning, not any kind of advantage. They were whether Paulette had spent her life showing up honestly in her work, whether my wife had spent her life building the kind of quiet resilience that doesn't shatter under pressure, and whether I had the sense, standing in a garage in Kingston with a wrong feeling in my chest, to trust what I knew and act on it. Those things saved her life. The other things, the will, the insurance, the calculations Sandra made in her search history, those things are sitting in an evidence box somewhere. and Martin has 6 years left on a sentence he earned. I'm not sure what else there is to say. You live the way you live, and it matters. That's all.